We turn now to new revelations that could signal the start of a purge at the top of Russia's military establishment. The Moscow Times and Financial Times have reported that General Sergei Surovikin has been arrested on suspicion of involvement in Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner group's failed rebellion. The New York Times also says Surovikin had advanced knowledge of Prigozhin's plans.
He was once the face of Russia's war in Ukraine. Sergei Surovikin, nicknamed General Armageddon for his brutality. Putin sent him to Ukraine to turn the tide. He took command of an army in crisis, in retreat and reeling after defeats on the battlefield. Surovikin began making his reputation in Chechnya in the 2000s, where he ordered reprisals against civilians. He then commanded forces in Syria in support of its government. He oversaw the brutal bombing of rebel-held Aleppo in 2016. The following year, Putin awarded him the Hero of Russia medal, the country's highest honour. With Surovikin in command in Ukraine, Russian forces changed tactics. As winter set in, they began to target Ukraine's energy infrastructure, plunging millions into darkness and cold and leaving them without water. Putin was pleased, giving Surovikin yet another medal, but just a month later, he relieved him of command. This man, Valery Gerasimov, took his job, and Surovikin became his deputy. When the Wagner group made its march on Moscow, Surovikin loyally towed the line.
I urge you to stop. The enemy is just waiting for the internal political situation to worsen in our country.
The question now is whether he knew more than he was letting on.
For more on this story, let's get comment from John Teichert, a retired brigadier general who recently served as Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of the U.S. Air Force International Affairs. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Claire, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We should say there's no official confirmation of the fate of Surovikin. Does it look to you, though, like Putin has started cleaning house?
So I think the biggest surprise in this is that we haven't seen more harsh measures by Putin. I do believe that he's probably been detained and is being investigated. But really what Putin needs to do to reestablish his authority is something that is far more grandiose than just a couple of interrogations and arrests. And I'm surprised we haven't seen that in the last 4 days or so.
Indeed, if it is true that Surovikin, one of Russia's top generals, knew about the mutiny and didn't try to stop it, what does that tell us about Putin's grip on power here?
Well, I think if you're going to be an authoritarian, you need to have authority. And I think it's interesting to see that there are probably many that sympathize with Prigozhin's thoughts about frustration and how the war in Ukraine has played out. And I think it indicates that this authoritarian leader in Putin probably has a whole lot less authority than maybe we would have expected 6 days ago.
What would you have potentially expected from Putin to assert that authority?
So I think that he needs to do some, in order to do what Putin does successfully, be very strong and strident in his crackdowns amongst those within the security establishment in Russia to demonstrate his authority and to purge out those that are not loyal. And the fact that he doesn't or hasn't done that up to this point is probably indicative of the fact that Putin himself questions whether he has the authority and the ability to actually crack down to the extent that he thinks that he probably needs to.
So let's talk about the stakes here. We've heard Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, warning that a weaker Putin is a greater danger. What is your take? Is a more unstable Russia a more dangerous Russia here?
I think in this case, Putin has a couple of options. One of them would be to undertake this crackdown that I think maybe he's showing part of now. But I think if he ultimately wants to regain authority, he has to do something more grandiose. And one of those things could be to lash out externally outside of Russia. I think that's the danger that Joseph is talking about there. But I think the better play for Putin would be to undertake a crackdown amongst the security forces there in Russia and maybe consider using this as a pretext to bring troops home from a failing war in Ukraine and show more security establishment presence on the streets of Moscow and around Russia. And I think one of those things is the only play for Putin now, and hopefully he'll take the one that's more reasonable by bringing troops home.
Yeah, how likely do you think that could be as an outcome?
Yeah, so I think ultimately Putin is looking at himself in the mirror and thinking about the last 16 months in Ukraine. And I think he realizes that while maybe we would have otherwise thought that time was on the side of Russia in this war, that probably now it's more apparent that time is on the side of Ukraine. And that the longer it takes for Putin to establish his aims in Ukraine, the less likely he is to be able to hold on to the authority that he desires. And maybe now this is the right pretext for him to pull troops home and establish his presence within Russia instead of meddling outside of Russia.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us on DW News. That is retired Brigadier General John Teichert. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Claire.
Well, earlier I spoke with DW's former Moscow bureau chief Yuri Rashetto. I asked him about the media report suggesting that General Surovikin has been arrested.
Well, there is a lot of speculation, Terry, that we can't verify. Some experts we've talked to seem to agree that at least Prigozhin's protest was well prepared. His troops moved too fast in the first hours of the march from different sides without facing any considerable resistance. Others say that the coup hadn't any goals or political demands and couldn't be a success at all. So why should Surovikin have taken part in it? But anyway, the name of General Surovikin has been mentioned for days. He was commander of, or he used to be commander of Russian forces in Ukraine from October last year to January this year, and he is considered one of the best military officers and was honored by Putin personally. Several media are indeed reporting his arrest. Allegedly, neither he himself nor his security service has been responding for more than 3 days already, but there are also many doubts about it. For example, at the moment he is the commander of the Russian airspace forces, and we know that Prigozhin's people were attacked only from the air on their march to Moscow. Also, during the mutiny, he publicly appealed to Prigozhin's people to stop immediately. So there are still many questions and doubts about his arrest.
What do you make, Yuri, of the allegations that the Russian military leaders at least, knew about Prigozhin's rebellion beforehand?
Well, two things seemed certain to me, Terry. First, Prigozhin was an extremely highly respected man in Russia until the near coup. He was, like kind of hero, and the paradox was, the more he criticized the defense minister, the greater his popularity became in Russia. The second thing is that Prigozhin, of course, cooperated closely with the Russian army and certainly knew many there well personally. But Prigozhin's Wagner force is not the only irregular Russian combat unit in Ukraine. There is some limited information about other so-called private armies in Russia. I've tried to gather some of this information in this report.
Superior training, better pay and equipment. That, at least, is the reputation enjoyed by private armies fighting for the Kremlin in Ukraine. The largest is made up by the mercenaries of the Wagner group, headed by Yevgeny Prigozhin. In the Russian media, they've come to symbolize Moscow's purported military might, notably during the protracted battle for Bakhmut. But behind the scenes, the force has become a mounting headache, particularly for the Defense Ministry and its boss. Prigozhin has publicly heaped scorn on Sergei Shoigu, branding him an arch-enemy and blaming him and his Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, for insufficient weapon supplies that have resulted in high Wagner casualties.
We're 70% short on ammo. Shoigu, Gerasimov, where is the ammunition?
Prigozhin or Shoigu, who would get the upper hand? President Putin appeared hesitant, but in mid-June he decided that volunteer fighters in Ukraine would have to sign contracts with the Defense Ministry. The official reason?
This is the only way to ensure social guarantees for mercenary fighters, because there is currently no contract with the state and no contract with the defense ministry.
For Prigozhin, the move would have meant signing a contract with his archenemy Shoigu. He categorically refused. Unlike his former ally from Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, his unit, Akhmat, is also viewed as a private army. The Kremlin claims it signed the contract with Shoigu. Up to 20 other private combat forces are said to have been integrated into the Russian army. It's unclear whether that includes mercenaries from Redut. The 7,000-strong unit was among the first to enter Ukraine when Putin launched his invasion. Or Potok, a force Ukraine's Secret Service claims is supplied and equipped by Russia's state-owned gas giant, Gazprom. According to the British newspaper The Financial Times, it includes Gazprom security guards. It's unclear how many men make up the suspected Gazprom militia, or how big a role they've played in the war in Ukraine. Troops like Redut and Potok fulfill 3 objectives, says military expert Pavel Lusin. In an interview with DW, he said they act as a counterweight to the regular army. They can operate outside the bureaucratic system and shield the political and military elite from assuming responsibility. Analysts say Moscow appears to be relying on mercenary groups to compensate for weaknesses within the regular Russian army. That might work, as long as they don't follow the lead of Prigozhin's Wagner group and rise up against the Kremlin. In the wake of their insurgency, some Wagner mercenaries have accepted an offer of exile in Belarus. Others are still fighting in Ukraine. It's unclear whether any have given in and integrated into the Russian army.
Your report there mentions several other paramilitary or mercenary groups besides Wagner. How significant are they for Russia?
They are pretty significant, and they are pretty successful. They seem to be very successful because private armies don't seem to have to struggle with bureaucratic problems that regular armed forces struggle with. The Russian army is a huge, heavy bureaucratic machine with established management procedures. Private armies can operate probably outside of that bureaucracy and are considered more effective because of it. But in the Wagner case, something totally exciting happened, something no one expected, Terry. When Prigozhin realized that he was no longer getting support from the state, he decided to go against his own state with his army. And I don't think his goal was to overthrow Putin, but he certainly weakened Putin. And who knows, maybe with the knowledge of even support of the army members.
It's been suggested, Yuri, that some of the Wagner mercenaries will go to Belarus, that some may be absorbed into the Russian army. Is Wagner being disbanded?
Well, we don't know anything specific about the Wagner soldiers today. At first, it was said that 8,000 soldiers, 8,000 men of Prigozhin went to Belarus. Then the other number was mentioned, 1,000. But all of these are speculations and media reports. What we know for sure is that the Wagner men were given 2 options by Putin personally. Putin said so in his televised speech on Monday. Either they join the regular army or sign the contract with the Minister of Defense, or they go to Belarus and they will not be prosecuted by Moscow. It's interesting, Terry, that the Belarusian ruler Lukashenko expressed his joy about the Wagner people on state television at the meeting with his defense minister. He said, wonderful, they can teach our soldiers a lot. And by the way, there are media reports that Prigozhin is back in Russia, allegedly, to meet with officials in St. Petersburg, the city he comes from. Who knows, maybe there are still discussing about the deal between him and the Russian officials, the Kremlin, maybe.
Yuri, thank you so much. That was DW's Yuri Rashetto in Riga.